3 weeks after my wife's funeral, I returned to our villa to find strangers drinking from her favorite teacup. My son sat laughing with his in-laws as they discussed renovations to my house. When I confronted them, my son's face went white with terror. What happened next would destroy our family forever. If you want to see how this family betrayal unfolds, smash that like button, share this story, and drop a comment about what you think the father should do. You won't believe how this ends. The front gate stood wide open, something Margaret would never have tolerated during the day when strangers might wander through our garden. Her prized rose bushes had been pruned back so severely they looked like thorny sticks poking from the earth, and the herb garden where she'd grown basil and thyme for 40 years had been replaced by geometric patches of ornamental grass. Even the brick pathway felt different under my feet, power-washed clean of the moss and weathering that had given it character. The old wooden mailbox that Margaret had painted with cheerful daisies was gone, replaced by a sleek black metal box that looked like it belonged in a corporate office park. I paused at the front steps, noting that someone had installed new outdoor lighting fixtures that cast harsh LED shadows instead of the warm amber glow from Margaret's antique carriage lamps. I pushed open the heavy oak door and immediately heard voices from the living room. Not hushed tones of respect for a house still heavy with grief, but animated conversation punctuated by comfortable laughter. Frank Morrison's voice boomed above the others, as if he were holding court in his own home. "Sarah, tell your mother about the contractor's estimate for the master bathroom renovation, the one with the walk-in shower and heated floors." His tone carried the satisfaction of someone discussing improvements to his own property. Linda's response came with the authority of a woman making executive decisions. "We'll need to coordinate that with the kitchen timeline. I've already spoken to the granite people about extending the countertops into the breakfast nook." As I moved closer to the living room entrance, I could see them arranged around my coffee table like a family meeting in progress. Frank had his feet propped up on Margaret's antique ottoman, the one she'd inherited from her grandmother and reupholstered 3 times over the decades. He was wearing house slippers and reading what looked like contractor brochures, making notes in the margins with Margaret's favorite fountain pen, the one I'd given her for our 20th anniversary. Linda sat in Margaret's reading chair, the burgundy leather armchair where my wife had spent her final months, using Margaret's embroidered bookmark to mark her place in what appeared to be a home decorating magazine. She was drinking from Margaret's china teacup, the delicate rose pattern that came out only for special occasions, while crumbs from her Danish pastry scattered carelessly across the hardwood floor. Some had even fallen onto the bottom shelf of Margaret's treasured bookcase, mixing with the dust that had settled on her collection of first-edition mystery novels, books she'd spent decades hunting for at estate sales and antiquarian shops, each one carefully preserved in protective sleeves that Linda had apparently removed and discarded nearby. David sat across from them on the sofa, leaning forward eagerly as Linda pointed to pictures in her magazine. As she gestured, more pastry crumbs tumbled from her lap onto the floor, and I watched one piece bounce off the spine of Margaret's beloved copy of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, the signed first edition she'd found at a church rummage sale and treasured above all her other books. "Your mother had such limited taste in window treatments," Linda was saying, her voice carrying the kind of gentle condescension reserved for criticizing the dead. She shifted in the chair, and her heel ground a piece of Danish pastry into the Persian rug beneath the bookcase, leaving a greasy stain on the wool fibers Margaret had hand-cleaned every spring for 30 years. "These heavy drapes make everything look so dated. We should go with something lighter, more contemporary." She gestured dismissively toward Margaret's handmade curtains, the ones she'd sewn herself after taking a community college class in interior design. Frank nodded without looking up from his brochures. "The whole place needs brightening up. Too much dark wood and old-fashioned furniture. Makes it feel like a museum instead of a home where people actually live. Sarah agrees completely, David said, his voice carrying an eagerness to please that I hadn't heard since his teenage years when he was trying to avoid punishment. She's been making lists of everything that needs updating. The bathroom fixtures, the kitchen appliances, even some of the furniture that's too worn to be worth keeping. He gestured around the room as if cataloging items for disposal. Linda smiled approvingly and reached across to pat his knee with the familiar affection of a mother praising a dutiful child. "You're so practical, David. It's exactly what this place needs. Someone who understands that houses are for living, not for preserving the past." Her fingers left a sticky residue from her pastry on his pants, but neither of them seemed to notice or care. That's when I stepped fully into the doorway, and the comfortable scene exploded into chaos. Frank's feet hit the floor with a thump that sent his contractor brochure sliding across the coffee table. Linda's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hand jerked in surprise, spilling Earl Grey across Margaret's lace doily. David shot up from the sofa so fast that Linda's magazine tumbled to the floor, its pages splaying open to reveal bathroom renovation ideas, circled in red ink. The sudden silence felt deafening after their animated conversation, broken only by the grandfather clock that had somehow survived whatever changes they'd made to the rest of the house. Frank cleared his throat and attempted a smile that looked more like a grimace, while Linda fumbled to clean up the spilled tea with Margaret's embroidered napkins. "Dad," David said, his voice cracking like a teenager caught sneaking in after curfew. His face had gone pale except for 2 bright red spots on his cheeks, and his hands hung at his sides as if he'd forgotten how to use them. "What are you doing here? I thought you were staying at the apartment until you felt ready to deal with all this." He gestured vaguely around the room, and I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Frank had managed to compose himself and was standing now, smoothing down his shirt and attempting to look dignified despite being caught lounging in house slippers in someone else's home. Linda remained seated in Margaret's chair, but her posture had shifted from relaxed ownership to defensive alertness. Like a cat caught on furniture, it knew it shouldn't occupy. Only then did I allow my eyes to truly survey what they had done to my home. The mantelpiece, where Margaret's collection of vintage photographs had stood for 30 years, was bare, except for 3 geometric candles that looked like they came from a hotel gift shop. Our wedding photo, the one where Margaret laughed so hard she nearly dropped her bouquet, was gone. David's baby pictures, his graduation photos, the candid shots of Margaret in her garden, all vanished as if our life together had been nothing more than outdated decoration. The walls had been painted over Margaret's soft sage green with stark white that made the room feel cold and sterile. Even the furniture arrangement had been changed, with pieces pushed against walls to create an open floor plan that eliminated the cozy conversation areas Margaret had carefully designed. Margaret's collection of antique books had been disturbed on the built-in shelves, some lying haphazardly on their sides with sticky fingerprints on their covers, others pushed aside to make room for decorative objects arranged with the impersonal precision of a furniture showroom. I could see where someone had set down a coffee mug directly on top of Margaret's leather-bound volume of Shakespeare sonnets, leaving a dark ring stain on the cover she'd spent hours conditioning and protecting. Several of her protective book sleeves lay crumpled in a corner like discarded gift wrap, and cake crumbs dotted the shelf edges where someone had been eating while browsing through her carefully catalogued collection. Her grandmother's china cabinet had been moved from its place of honor beside the fireplace to a corner where it looked cramped and awkward, its contents rearranged according to color rather than the careful organization by pattern and occasion that Margaret had maintained. The Persian rug that had anchored the room for 20 years was gone. replaced by something modern in neutral beige that showed every footprint and crumb. Even the lighting had been changed. Margaret's warm table lamps replaced by overhead fixtures that cast everything in harsh, unflattering brightness. The bay window where Margaret had spent countless mornings with her tea and crossword puzzles had been stripped of her flowing curtains and fitted with stark white blinds that blocked the view of her rose garden. Her writing desk, where she'd maintained our household accounts and written letters to distant relatives, had been cleared of all her personal touches. The silver letter opener that had been her mother's, the small ceramic dish where she kept paper clips and rubber bands, the framed photo of us at our son's college graduation. In their place sat a laptop computer and a stack of renovation magazines, as if Margaret's careful attention to our family's business had been replaced by someone else's vision for our future. This was still my home, still the place where Margaret and I had built our life together. But it had been stripped of everything that made it ours. David's hand wrapped around my elbow with the desperate grip of someone drowning. "Dad, can we talk privately for a minute?" His voice cracked on the word privately, and sweat had begun to bead along his hairline despite the cool morning air. He tugged me toward the hallway, stepping around the pastry crumbs Linda had scattered across Margaret's Persian rug without seeming to notice them. Behind us, I could hear Frank clearing his throat and Linda muttering something about unexpected interruptions, while the grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, the only sound in the house that remained unchanged. As David pulled me toward the narrow corridor that led to Margaret's old sewing room, he kept glancing over his shoulder as if checking whether his in-laws were following or listening. His fingers left damp prints on my jacket sleeve. The hallway felt even more foreign than the living room had. Margaret's watercolor paintings, amateur efforts from the art classes she'd taken after David left for college, had been replaced by abstract prints in harsh geometric patterns that hurt to look at in the morning light. The small antique table where she'd kept her reading glasses and a bowl of peppermints for guests was gone, replaced by a sleek modern console that looked like it belonged in a doctor's waiting room. Even the family photos that had lined these walls for decades had vanished, leaving behind faint rectangular shadows on the wallpaper where they'd hung. Through the cracked door of Margaret's former sewing room, I could see cardboard boxes stacked against the windows and her antique Singer machine pushed into a corner under a dusty tarp. David stopped beside the doorway, his shoulders hunched like a child expecting punishment. "Dad, I need you to understand something," David began, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. His hands found the hem of his shirt and began twisting the fabric between his fingers, the same nervous habit he'd developed as a 7-year-old whenever Margaret caught him in a lie about broken dishes or missing cookies. The gesture transported me back 30 years to this same hallway, where he'd stood shuffling his feet and explaining why his baseball had somehow found its way through Mrs. Henderson's kitchen window. "This whole situation isn't what you think it is," he said, his eyes darting everywhere except my face, to the new console table, to the unfamiliar artwork, to his own shoes scuffing against the hardwood floor. "Sarah has been really struggling since Mom's funeral. Having her parents nearby has been the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart." From the living room came the sound of furniture being moved and Linda's voice carrying clearly down the hall. "Frank, help me get this bookshelf cleared properly. Some of these old books are going to need professional cleaning after sitting here collecting dust for so long." The casual dismissal in her tone made my chest tighten, but David seemed oblivious to the implications of her words. Frank's deeper voice rumbled a response I couldn't make out, followed by the distinctive sound of books being stacked. Not carefully, but with the efficiency of someone clearing inventory. David's grip on his shirt tightened until his knuckles went white. "They're just trying to help organize things while you're getting your bearings," he said quickly. Too quickly. You know how overwhelming all this stuff can be when you're grieving. They seem very comfortable here, I said quietly. And David's face went from pale to flushed in the span of a heartbeat. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, and I could see a thin film of perspiration forming on his upper lip, despite the coolness of the hallway. Well, yes, we wanted them to feel at home, he stammered. Sarah needed her parents close, and it didn't make sense for them to pay for a hotel when this house has so many empty rooms. His explanation felt rehearsed, as if he'd practiced it in front of a mirror, but his delivery lacked conviction. Behind us, the sound of books hitting the floor made him flinch, though he tried to cover it by running his free hand through his hair. Besides, you said yourself after Mom got sick that this place was too big for one person to manage alone. The sound of Linda's heels clicked across the hardwood as she moved from room to room with the confidence of someone conducting an inspection of her own property. "David," she called, her voice carrying the authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Where did your mother keep the insurance papers for these antiques? Frank wants to see what kind of coverage you have on the furniture." David's whole body seemed to vibrate with nervous energy, like a guitar string tuned too tight. "Just a minute, Linda," he called back, his voice tight with strain. "Dad and I are just catching up." But Linda's footsteps had already moved into the dining room, and I could hear her opening drawers and cabinets with the systematic thoroughness of someone taking inventory. "Dad, please," David whispered, desperation making his voice thin and reedy. "Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. Linda and Frank aren't trying to take anything from you. They just want to help make sure everything is properly maintained and protected." His eyes pleaded with me to understand something he couldn't quite articulate, some arrangement he'd made that required my cooperation to succeed. "You've been so overwhelmed since Mom died, and this takes some of the pressure off your shoulders. You don't have to worry about upkeep or security or any of those complicated homeowner responsibilities." The words tumbled out faster now, gaining a desperate momentum. "They have experience with estate management, and they know people who can help preserve Mom's things the right way." "Estate management?" I repeated, and David's face crumpled for just a moment before he forced it back into a mask of strained pleasantness. "I just mean, making sure everything is cataloged and stored properly so nothing gets damaged or lost," he said, but his voice had lost what little conviction it had possessed. From the dining room came the sound of china being moved, and Linda's approving murmur as she apparently found what she was looking for. "Frank has connections with appraisers who can tell us what things are worth, for insurance purposes," David added weakly. "And Linda knows how to organize everything so it's easier to maintain." His hands finally released his shirt and hung limp at his sides, defeated by his own transparent explanations. The hallway had grown silent, except for the distant sounds of Linda and Frank moving through the house with increasing confidence, opening drawers and examining contents as if conducting a professional evaluation. David stood before me like a child caught stealing from his mother's purse, his shoulders sagging under some invisible weight that grew heavier with each lie he told. "How long have they been staying here?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer would be another carefully constructed half-truth. David's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. "Just since last week," he finally managed, but his eyes darted toward the living room where Linda's voice was now discussing something about market values with Frank. "Maybe a little longer. Time gets confused when you're dealing with grief." Linda's heels clicked back down the hallway, and her shadow appeared at the edge of my vision before she stepped into view with Margaret's jewelry box in her hands, the carved wooden box Margaret's father had made for her 16th birthday. "David, honey," Linda said with the casual authority of someone interrupting a minor conversation, "we really need to get these valuables into proper storage before someone gets careless with them." She held up Margaret's jewelry box, as if it were evidence of poor household management rather than a treasured keepsake. Some of these pieces look quite valuable, and they shouldn't just be sitting out where anything could happen to them. David's face went white, and his mouth worked soundlessly as he struggled to find words that might explain why his mother-in-law was handling his deceased mother's most personal possessions as if they were her responsibility to protect. The silence stretched between the three of us like a taut wire, filled with everything David wasn't saying and everything Linda wasn't asking permission for. From the living room, Frank's voice called out cheerfully, "Linda, you should see the condition of some of these books. Somebody's been eating over them. There are crumbs and stains on half the collection." His tone suggested mild annoyance, rather than the horror I felt at hearing him discuss Margaret's treasured library as if it were damaged merchandise. David's shoulders sagged further, and I realized that whatever arrangement he'd made with his in-laws had already progressed far beyond temporary house guests helping with organization. They were conducting a methodical assessment of everything Margaret and I had built together, and my son was not just allowing it, he was facilitating it. 3 days later, I found myself back at the villa with my own key, though using it now felt like trespassing in a house that had been systematically stripped of its soul. The morning sun streamed through the bay window where Margaret used to sit with her crossword puzzles, but the light felt different now. Harsher, colder, illuminating surfaces that had been scrubbed clean of her presence. I settled into the burgundy leather armchair that had somehow survived Linda's renovation enthusiasm, probably because it was too heavy for her to move without Frank's help. The leather was worn smooth where Margaret's hands had rested during her final months, and I found myself tracing the familiar grooves with my fingertips, feeling for the warmth that was no longer there. The house around me was silent, except for the grandfather clock, its steady ticking the only heartbeat remaining in a home that had once pulsed with life. From the garage came the distinctive sound of a car door slamming, followed by footsteps on the concrete floor and the mechanical whir of the garage door closing. David's voice carried through the walls as he spoke to someone on his phone, his tone animated and confident in a way I hadn't heard in years. No, Sarah, the insurance will cover most of it," he was saying, his words punctuated by the jingle of keys and the rustle of shopping bags. "Linda was right about the deductible, but it's still a bargain considering what we're getting." The conversation continued for several minutes, filled with references to contractors and delivery schedules and approval from people whose names I didn't recognize. When the garage door finally opened into the house, David appeared wearing a black leather jacket emblazoned with the silver logo of a luxury car brand that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The jacket was clearly new, its leather still stiff and unmarked by wear, and it fit him with the precision that came only from professional tailoring. Beneath it, he wore a silk shirt in deep burgundy that complemented the jacket's expensive sheen, and his shoes were Italian leather, polished to mirror brightness. Even his haircut looked fresh and professionally styled, the kind that required monthly maintenance at salons that charged more per visit than Margaret used to spend on groceries in a month. He moved with a swagger I'd never seen before, his shoulders back, and his chin raised, as if he were modeling for a magazine spread, rather than walking through his childhood home. The transformation was so complete that for a moment I wondered if grief had affected my vision, making me see a stranger where my son should be. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying a note of surprise that didn't quite mask his underlying confidence. "I didn't expect to see you here today. I thought you were staying at the apartment until we got everything sorted out." He set down several shopping bags from stores whose names appeared in gold lettering on thick, expensive paper, the kind of bags that people kept and reused to signal their purchasing power to others. The rustle of tissue paper and the glimpse of more luxury items inside made it clear that his morning had been spent in the kinds of establishments where prices were never discussed and credit limits were assumed to be irrelevant. "I was just picking up a few things Sarah needed for the house," he added, though his defensive tone suggested he knew the explanation was inadequate. "That car outside," I said, my voice low and steady as I continued tracing the worn armrest of Margaret's chair. "I had to co-sign for it too, didn't I?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years. David's confident posture wavered for just a moment, and I saw his hand move instinctively to touch the jacket's silver logo, as if drawing strength from its symbol of success. His laugh came too quickly, too forced, the sound of someone who had practiced casual responses to uncomfortable questions. "Dad, you've always helped me when I needed it," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture that was meant to appear magnanimous, but came across as entitled. "I just needed some pride in front of Sarah's family, you know?" He began pacing the length of the living room, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood with the rhythm of someone who couldn't remain still under scrutiny. The car, the clothes, even some of the improvements we're making to this place. Haven't you and Mom always given me everything I needed to succeed? His voice carried a mixture of confidence and defensiveness, as if he were simultaneously proud of his acquisitions and resentful that anyone might question his right to them. "Linda and Frank come from money. Real money. And Sarah deserves to feel like she married someone who can provide for her at the same level she's accustomed to." The shopping bags rustled as he gestured toward them, evidence of his ability to maintain appearances that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. I remained silent for a long moment, letting my gaze rest on his face while he continued his nervous pacing. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the background, marking time that felt suspended between his expectation of approval and my growing understanding of what he'd become. His jacket caught the morning light with each turn, the silver logo winking like a beacon, announcing his financial dependence disguised as success. "Your mother left this villa to me," I finally said, my voice cold as winter air, "because she knew you only knew how to spend, never how to cherish." The words fell between us with the weight of truth that had been avoided for too long. A son of this house, yet living like a passerby who never understood what home really meant. David stopped pacing abruptly, his face flushing red from his collar to his hairline, as if I'd slapped him across the cheek. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and the careful composure he'd maintained cracked like ice under sudden pressure. "You've always looked down on me," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls that had heard Margaret and me discuss his future in whispered conversations filled with hope and worry. "Every decision I make, every choice I try to make for my own family, you find some way to criticize it." His chest rose and fell with rapid breathing, and sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the coolness of the morning air. The expensive clothes that had given him confidence moments before now seemed like a costume that no longer fit properly. "Without me," he continued, his voice growing louder and more desperate with each word, "you'd be nothing but a lonely old man rattling around in this museum, talking to pictures and living in the past like some kind of ghost." His arms swept wide to encompass the room, taking in the remaining furniture and the empty spaces where Margaret's touches had been systematically removed. "What do you even need this villa for, except to wallow in memories that won't bring her back?" The final words came out as a near scream, his composure completely shattered by emotions he'd apparently been holding back for weeks. His face was now bright red, and his hands shook as he pointed accusingly at the chair where I sat surrounded by the last remnants of the life Margaret and I had built together. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening, broken only by his ragged breathing and the imperturbable ticking of the grandfather clock that had witnessed 40 years of family conversations, celebrations, and now this moment of complete breakdown in trust and respect. The morning light, streaming through Margaret's bay window, cast long shadows across the floor, and I could see dust motes dancing in the sunbeams where her reading chair used to catch the perfect angle of illumination. My words about squandering versus valuing hung between us like a blade that had found its mark, and I watched my son's face cycle through expressions of shock, shame, and something approaching panic. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and then David's control finally snapped like a wire pulled too tight. "Do you know that without this villa, I'd have no face left with my wife's family?" The words came out in a rush, as if they'd been building pressure behind a dam that had suddenly burst. Something in his tone shifted, becoming desperate rather than simply angry, and I felt a chill of suspicion creep up my spine like cold fingers. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The question seemed to deflate him slightly, and he stumbled backward until he hit the wall where Margaret's family photographs used to hang. His expensive shoes scuffed against the baseboards as he slid down slightly, his back pressed against the wallpaper as if he were trying to disappear into the very structure of the house. The bravado that had carried him through his outburst evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind something raw and frightened that reminded me of the little boy who used to hide behind Margaret's skirts when strangers came to visit. "I told them this house was mine," he said, the words coming out in a barely audible rush. "When Sarah and I got engaged, when we were planning the wedding, Linda kept asking about family assets and what kind of inheritance I could expect." His voice cracked on the word inheritance, and he had to pause to clear his throat before continuing. "They come from money, Dad. Real money. And they kept making comments about Sarah marrying beneath her station, about how their family had always been careful to maintain their social position through strategic marriages." The confession poured out of him like water through a broken dam, each word adding weight to the growing horror I felt settling in my chest. "So, I told them the villa was mine. I showed them through the house, let them think Margaret had already signed it over to me as part of estate planning." His eyes darted around the room as if looking for escape routes, but found only the evidence of changes that Linda and Frank had already begun implementing. "They were so impressed, Dad. For the first time, they looked at me like I was worthy of their daughter." His voice broke completely on the last words, and I saw tears gathering in the corners of his eyes, though whether from shame or self-pity, I couldn't tell. "They've already poured money into renovations," he continued, his voice gaining a desperate momentum, as if speed could somehow make the confession less damaging. "Linda hired contractors based on my assurances that I had full authority to make changes. Frank prepared loan documents using the villa as collateral for some business investments he wanted to make." Each revelation hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain still, to let him finish destroying whatever remained of our relationship with his web of lies. "If you deny it now, if you tell them the truth, they'll lose everything they've invested. The contractors expect payment, the loans will be called in, and Frank could lose his business." His hands were shaking so violently now that he pressed them against the wall to steady himself. I clenched my fists in my lap, feeling my nails dig into the palms of my hands until I was sure they would leave marks. The pain was sharp and immediate, a welcome distraction from the suffocating grief that threatened to overwhelm me. It wasn't only anger I felt, though that was certainly there, burning like acid in my chest, but also a profound sadness that cut deeper than any rage could reach. The son that Margaret and I had sacrificed for, The boy we'd worked 2 jobs to put through college, the man we'd co-signed loans for and supported through every financial crisis, was now using her memorial home as nothing more than a token to buy acceptance from people who would never truly respect him. "So to you," I said, my voice becoming quieter rather than louder, as my disappointment crystallized into something harder than anger. "Your parents were just an open wallet, and this house just a ticket to buy face." David's face crumpled as if I'd struck him, but he didn't deny the accusation. Instead, he slid further down the wall until he was nearly crouching, his expensive clothes wrinkling against the baseboards as he seemed to physically shrink before my eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the grandfather clock's steady rhythm. I thought maybe after you'd had time to grieve, you'd understand. Maybe you'd even be proud that I'd found a way to make the house profitable, instead of just letting it sit here collecting dust and memories." The words revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of what the house meant, not just to me, but to the 40 years Margaret and I had spent building our life within its walls, that I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. I reached down beside Margaret's chair and retrieved the leather briefcase I'd brought with me, moving with deliberate slowness as David watched through eyes red with unshed tears. The folder inside contained documents I'd hoped never to need, legal papers that Margaret's attorney had insisted we prepare during her final illness, when she'd grown worried about David's increasing financial dependency and poor judgment. "This villa is legally under my name," I said, placing the folder on the coffee table with enough force to make David flinch. "No one has the right to turn it into collateral with empty promises." I opened the folder and spread the documents across the table's surface, each page stamped with official seals and signed with Margaret's careful signature from the months before her illness made writing impossible. David stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language, his mouth opening and closing without sound as the implications of what he was seeing began to penetrate his panic. The deed, the will, the power of attorney documents, all of it spelled out in clear legal language that left no room for the fantasy he'd constructed for his in-laws. "She knew," I said quietly, watching him process the reality that his mother had anticipated this moment and taken steps to prevent it. "Margaret knew exactly what kind of man you were becoming, and she made sure these documents were ironclad." His face went from red to gray as he read, his expensive clothes now looking like a costume on someone playing a role they'd never been qualified for. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of lies exposed and the sound of a relationship dying in real time. The living room had grown dim as clouds moved across the sun, casting shadows that seemed to gather in the corners like witnesses to a family's destruction. David remained crouched against the wall where my revelation about the legal documents had left him, his expensive leather jacket now wrinkled and twisted as if it were strangling him rather than displaying his success. The grandfather clock's ticking had become the only constant sound in a house that felt suspended between past and future, between the memories Margaret had treasured and the cold reality of what our son had become. I could hear his breathing, shallow, rapid gulps of air as if the oxygen in the room had suddenly become too thin to sustain him. The papers spread across the coffee table seemed to glow in the filtered light, each official seal and signature marking another boundary he couldn't cross, another lie he couldn't sustain. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. I remained seated in Margaret's chair, my hands resting on the worn armrests where her fingers had traced patterns during her final months, while David processed the legal reality that had shattered his carefully constructed deception. His face cycled through expressions: shock, denial, calculation, as if he were running through possible escape routes and finding each one blocked by his mother's foresight. The shopping bags from his morning expedition lay forgotten beside the wall, their expensive contents now seeming pathetic rather than impressive, like props from a play that had ended badly. When he finally moved, it was to push himself up from his crouch and stumble toward the chair across from me, his legs unsteady as a newborn colt's. He slumped into the chair with none of the swagger he'd displayed when he first arrived home. His shoulders hunched, and his head hanging as if the weight of his lies had become a physical burden too heavy to bear. His hands shook as he wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving damp streaks across his skin that caught the dim light streaming through the window. For a moment I thought he might finally accept the reality of his situation, might find some shred of the boy Margaret and I had raised with such hope and love. But then something hardened in his expression, a stubborn defiance that reminded me of his teenage years when he'd been caught in lies and chose to dig deeper rather than admit fault. A growl escaped from his throat, low and animal-like, as he straightened in the chair and tried to reassemble his shattered confidence. "You think a few papers will settle everything?" he said, his voice rough with emotion but gaining strength as he spoke. "I'm your son by blood. The law won't let you cut me off completely." His hands were still trembling, but he pressed them against his thighs to hide the shaking, and his chin lifted with a defiance that would have been admirable if it weren't built on such rotten foundations. "I have the right to a forced inheritance. No matter what Mom wrote in her will, no matter what legal tricks you think you can pull, I'm your only child and the law protects that." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge thrown down by a cornered animal. I could see him calculating behind his eyes, weighing the costs of a legal battle against the potential gains, convincing himself that blood ties would trump his mother's careful planning. His breathing had steadied slightly, and some color had returned to his face as he grasped onto this new hope like a drowning man clutching driftwood. "You can't disinherit your only son," he continued, his voice gaining confidence with each word. "Linda's father is a lawyer, and he's already explained to me how these things work. Family courts always side with blood relatives, especially when there's evidence of diminished capacity due to grief." The implied threat in his final words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain still, to let him finish revealing the full extent of his desperation and moral bankruptcy. He was threatening to challenge my mental competency, to drag Margaret's memory through the courts by suggesting that grief had impaired my judgment. The boy who had cried in my arms when his goldfish died was now prepared to destroy his father's reputation to get what he wanted. I sat quietly for a long moment, letting the weight of his threat settle between us while the grandfather clock marked time with its relentless rhythm. Then I reached up and slowly removed my reading glasses, setting them on the table beside the legal documents with the deliberate precision of someone preparing for surgery. "Forced inheritance?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying the kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty. "Yes, you can file a claim. The law does protect children's inheritance rights, even from parents who might wish to cut them off entirely." David's face brightened slightly, thinking he'd found his victory, but I wasn't finished. "But do you know something, David? Your mother thought of this day already." I reached down beside the chair and retrieved a second folder from my briefcase, this one thicker than the first, and bound with a red ribbon that Margaret had tied herself during one of her final lucid moments. The sight of her careful knot made my throat tighten, but I forced myself to continue. I flipped open the folder and spread additional pages across the coffee table, each one stamped with the same official seals that had authenticated the previous documents. "In her will, your mother stated very clearly that any share you might claim from my estate through forced inheritance must be held in a trust fund." My voice remained steady, but I could feel Margaret's presence in every word, her determination to protect our son from himself, even when it meant limiting his access to what we'd built together. You can only access those funds when you turn 50, and only then if you meet certain conditions regarding financial responsibility and family obligations. David's face went from hopeful to stricken as the implications became clear, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "You want to drag me to court?" I continued, my words falling like stones into still water. "Fine, but you'll only be locking yourself into the trap your mother left for you." The papers rustled as I pointed to specific clauses that Margaret's attorney had crafted with surgical precision, each one designed to prevent exactly the kind of reckless behavior David had been displaying. The trust includes provisions for regular financial audits, requirements for steady employment, and penalties for any attempts to use family assets as collateral for personal debts. His hands had begun trembling again, more violently than before, and I could see sweat forming on his upper lip despite the cool morning air. David sat frozen in his chair, his face gone stiff as carved stone, his eyes wide with the kind of despair that comes from realizing that every escape route has been blocked by someone who knew you better than you knew yourself. His expensive clothes suddenly looked like a costume worn by an actor who had forgotten his lines, and the confident swagger he'd displayed earlier had evaporated completely, leaving behind only a frightened man facing the consequences of his choices. She couldn't have," he whispered, but his voice trailed off as he read the documents spread before him, each paragraph spelling out the careful boundaries Margaret had constructed around his inheritance. I felt no triumph in watching my son's world collapse around him, only a profound sadness that it had come to this moment where I had to use Margaret's final words as weapons against the child we had loved so desperately. My voice carried more sorrow than anger when I spoke again, each word weighted with the grief of watching a relationship die in real time. "Your mother loved you, David. Even in death, she tried to protect you from your own greed, tried to give you time to grow into the man she always hoped you could become." I gestured toward the papers that contained her last attempts to save him from himself. "But what have you become?" The question hung in the air between us like an epitaph for the boy he had once been, while the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, and the morning light continued to fade behind gathering clouds. David sat speechless in his chair, his hands trembling, and his eyes filled with the kind of despair that comes from realizing that your mother's love had been deeper and more prescient than you had ever imagined, and that her final gift to you was the very thing that would prevent you from destroying yourself completely. The air in the living room had grown thick as storm clouds, heavy with the weight of revelations that had stripped away 40 years of pretense and left only the stark truth of what we had become. David remained slumped in his chair like a marionette with severed strings, his expensive clothes now looking like a costume discarded by an actor who had forgotten his lines. The trust fund documents lay scattered across the coffee table between us, each page a testament to Margaret's foresight and his own spectacular miscalculation. I could hear his breathing, shallow, rapid gulps that suggested a man drowning in consequences he had never bothered to consider. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to grow louder in the silence, marking the seconds until whatever remained of our relationship would be buried beneath the weight of his choices. I stood slowly, my joints protesting after the emotional strain of the morning, and began to pace the length of the room with measured steps. My eyes traced each wall and window where Margaret's presence had once lingered like perfume in a jewelry box, now replaced by Linda's aggressive renovations and Frank's casual disregard for anything that didn't generate profit. The empty spaces where our family photographs had hung seemed to watch me like open wounds, while the remaining furniture sat arranged according to someone else's vision of how people should live. "Your mother foresaw it all," I said, my voice low and deliberate as I moved past the bay window where she used to sit with her mystery novels. "She feared the day you'd turn against me, feared you'd chase vanity and forget kinship." David's head remained bowed, but I could see his shoulders tense at my words, and his hands clenched into fists where they rested on his thighs. "That's why she left the will as it is," I continued, pausing beside the fireplace where our wedding portrait once smiled down from the mantel. "But she also asked me for one last thing, something she made me promise to do if you ever tried to use this house as a bargaining chip." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and I watched David's head snap up with the sudden alertness of prey that had just detected a predator. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky but still carrying a thread of defiance, like a child who hadn't yet learned that his tantrum wouldn't change the adult world around him. His eyes were wide with something approaching panic, but also with the desperate hope of someone who believed there might still be an escape route he hadn't considered. "Are you going to hold on to this house until you die, so I get nothing? Is that your plan? To punish me for trying to make something of myself?" His voice cracked on the final words, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the coolness of the morning air. The expensive clothes that had given him such confidence earlier now seemed to hang on him like a costume that no longer fit. I turned slowly, making sure my eyes met his before I spoke the words that would end whatever fantasy he had constructed about his future inheritance. "No, David," I said, my voice carrying the quiet finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Because this villa will no longer belong to either you or me." The statement hit him like a physical blow, and I watched his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and the beginning of true desperation as the implications began to penetrate his panic-clouded thinking. His mouth opened and closed several times without sound, like a fish gasping on dry land while his hands began to tremble with increasing violence. I reached into my briefcase one final time and withdrew a folder I had hoped never to use, its contents representing the most painful decision Margaret and I had ever made together during her final weeks. The document inside was crisp and official, bearing the seals of both the county clerk and the local historical society, and I laid it on the table with the same reverence I might have shown for Margaret's final letter. "Last week, I signed an agreement with the local council," I said, watching David's eyes glue themselves to the papers as if he could change their contents through sheer force of will. "This villa will become a community center and memorial for your mother. It no longer belongs to any individual." David snatched up the document with hands that shook so violently the papers rustled like autumn leaves, his eyes scanning the text with the desperate intensity of someone looking for a loophole in his own death sentence. I watched his face blanch, white as newly fallen snow, then cycle through shades of gray as the full impact of what he was reading began to register. His lips quivered as if he were trying to speak, but no words emerged from his throat, only a soft, keening sound like air escaping from a punctured tire. The document began to crumple in his grip as his hands unconsciously clenched, and his eyes grew wide with the kind of panic that comes from realizing that your last trump card has not only been played, but has been revealed as worthless. At that precise moment, as if summoned by some cosmic sense of timing, the front door opened with a bang that echoed through the house like a gunshot. Sarah's voice carried from the entryway, high and excited as she called to her parents about some success they'd apparently achieved that morning. "Mom, Dad, wait until you hear about the contractor estimates we got for the master suite renovation." Her words were followed by the confident click of Linda's heels and the heavier tread of Frank's expensive shoes as they made their way toward the living room with the casual authority of people returning to their own home. They froze in the doorway when they saw David crumpled in his chair and me standing beside the coffee table covered with legal documents, their faces shifting from confident satisfaction to suspicion in the space of a heartbeat. Frank's frown deepened the lines around his eyes as he took in the scene before him, his gaze moving from David's devastated expression to the papers scattered across the table to my own carefully controlled composure. "You told us this villa was yours," he said, his voice rising with the indignation of a man who had been caught in someone else's lie. "You made us spend money on renovations, sign loan papers with the house as collateral. What the hell is this?" His face had gone red with rage, and I could see the veins standing out in his neck as his businessman's instincts screamed that he had been swindled by an amateur. Linda stood beside him with her mouth slightly open, her usual air of superiority replaced by the bewildered expression of someone whose carefully laid plans had just been exposed as built on quicksand. David tried to speak, his mouth working like that of a landed fish, but only stammered fragments emerged. I only... Dad would... Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort, and his face had taken on the gray pallor of someone facing financial ruin. Sarah stood behind her parents, her expression shifting from confusion to disgust as she began to understand the scope of her husband's deception, her eyes narrowing with the contempt of someone who had just discovered that her spouse was not the man she thought she had married. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest as I looked at each of their faces in turn, seeing the moment when their comfortable assumptions crumbled like sand castles before an incoming tide. "This house is mine," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through the air that had suddenly become thick with recriminations and panic. "And as of last week, it has been signed over as a community center and memorial for his mother. It is no longer a pawn for anyone to buy, borrow, or seize." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread across each face in turn. The room exploded into chaos as the full implications of my announcement hit everyone simultaneously. David slumped further in his chair, his face now completely drained of color as he realized that every lie he had told, every promise he had made, every scheme he had constructed had just collapsed in spectacular fashion. Sarah's glare could have melted steel as she stared at her husband with the kind of contempt reserved for con artists and embezzlers, while Frank's rage reached a crescendo that made his earlier indignation seem mild by comparison. "Then what about the money we put in?" he roared, his face now purple with fury as he realized that his business investments had been based on a fantasy. I looked at each of them with the calm detachment of someone who had just watched a house of cards collapse under its own weight, and my voice remained steady as I delivered the final blow. "Ask your son-in-law. I never agreed to anything." The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and David's occasional attempts to speak. Weak, stammering sounds that died in his throat before they could form coherent words. His hands remained clenched in his lap, white-knuckled fists that trembled with impotent rage and humiliation, while his eyes stayed fixed on the floor as if meeting anyone's gaze might somehow make his shame more real. The community center documents lay scattered across the coffee table like leaves from a dead tree, each page bearing official seals that made his lies not just exposed, but legally irrelevant. Frank's pacing had worn a path in Margaret's Persian rug, his Italian leather shoes scuffing against fibers that had once been carefully maintained, but were now just another casualty of his family's greed and disrespect. "You stupid, worthless little worm," Frank finally exploded, whirling to face David with the fury of a man who had discovered his business partner was an embezzler. His face had gone from red to purple, and spittle flew from his lips as he jabbed his finger toward the crumpled figure in the chair. "Do you have any idea what you've cost us? The contractors, the loan applications, the business investments, all of it based on your pathetic lies." His voice echoed off the walls that had once heard Margaret's gentle laughter, filling the space with a venom that seemed to poison the very air. Linda nodded in sharp agreement, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing dismissively toward David, as if he were something unpleasant she'd discovered on the bottom of her shoe. "We should have known better than to trust someone who couldn't even afford decent clothes without Mommy and Daddy's help," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to people who measured worth in dollar signs. Sarah's contribution to her husband's destruction was perhaps the most devastating of all, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon making a final cut. "I can't believe I married such a pathetic loser," she said, her voice carrying the flat disappointment of someone discussing a failed investment rather than the collapse of a marriage. "My friends always wondered what I saw in you, and now I'm wondering the same thing." Her eyes had the calculating look of someone already planning her escape, measuring the social and financial costs of being associated with David's spectacular failure. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, probably alerting her social circle to distance themselves from the impending scandal. "At least the prenup protects my assets," she added without looking up from her screen, the final nail in the coffin of whatever dignity David might have retained. David made a sound like a wounded animal, a low keening that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. His shoulders shook with what might have been sobs, though no tears fell from his eyes, as if even his body had given up on the pretense of emotional response. The silver logo on his leather jacket caught the afternoon light with each tremor, a mockery of the success he'd tried so desperately to project. His mouth moved soundlessly, forming words that never gained enough substance to escape his throat, while his hands opened and closed like the claws of a dying crab. The transformation from the confident man who'd strutted through the door that morning to this broken figure was complete, leaving behind only the hollow shell of someone who'd gambled everything on lies and lost spectacularly. Through this cacophony of recriminations and collapse, I remained standing beside Margaret's chair, my hand resting on the worn leather armrest where her fingers had traced patterns during her final months. The chaos swirling around me felt distant and unreal, like watching a play performed by actors who'd forgotten they were pretending. The afternoon light streaming through the windows painted everything in golden hues that reminded me of happier times, when this room had been filled with love rather than greed, with memories rather than schemes. I thought of Margaret's last request, made during one of our final conversations when she was still lucid enough to understand what our son was becoming. "If he ever tries to use this house as a bargaining chip," she'd whispered, "promise me you'll make sure it goes to people who will cherish it the way we have." I rose slowly from beside the chair, my joints protesting the emotional and physical strain of the day, and reached for the old fedora I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, the one she'd bought me for our 30th anniversary, because she said it made me look distinguished. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted it from the table. Whether from age or emotion, I couldn't say, but my posture remained straight despite the weight of what I'd had to do. The hat felt heavy in my fingers, carrying the weight of 40 years of memories, and the knowledge that this would be the last time I wore it in the house where Margaret and I had built our life together. "This house is no longer for bargaining," I said, my voice low, but carrying enough authority to cut through the chaos of accusations and self-pity. "It is your mother's memory, and a gift to those who will cherish it. I have kept my promise to her." The words seemed to drain what little fight remained in the room. Frank's pacing slowed to a halt, his rage giving way to the defeated posture of a man who'd lost a battle he'd thought was already won. Linda's superior expression crumbled into something resembling shame, though whether for her behavior or simply for being caught in such an undignified situation, I couldn't tell. Sarah continued typing on her phone, but her movements had become mechanical, as if she were going through motions rather than executing a plan. David remained motionless in his chair, a broken figure who couldn't even summon the energy to look up at his father's final pronouncement. His hands had gone limp in his lap, and his breathing had become so shallow it was barely visible, as if the life were slowly draining out of him along with his prospects. As I stepped toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet, I allowed myself one final glance back at the room that had been the heart of our home for 4 decades. The afternoon light had shifted, casting everything in deeper shadows, but I could still see the places where Margaret's presence had once made every corner warm and welcoming. The empty spaces on the mantel where our photographs had smiled down, the bay window where she'd sat with her books and tea, the chair where she'd spent her final months surrounded by love. All of it was changing hands, but none of it would truly be lost. In my heart, a voice echoed like a gentle farewell, carrying the weight of promises kept and love transcendent. A house can change hands, but love and memories never will. Rest easy, my love. I've done as you asked.